I'm delighted to be here. So my thanks to Monica, to Nicole, to others, to the Tocqueville seminar. It's a real delight to be part of this project, a difficult project, of reminding ourselves that we who live in the United States also live in the world, and we do both always at the same time. I don't think I'm the ideal person to start this off at all. Atlantic Crossing was a very long book and a very tangled book, and this lecture may have some of those threads to it. But let me tell you that I would like to take us through some questions about rhetoric and maybe moral claims. Say something about what it is we're doing when we say the United States is or is not an exceptional nation. And then I'd like to take you through some historical work that others have been doing that I find very exciting. And I want to try to end by bringing those two briefly together. And if I succeed for all of us, me as well as you, in breaking down some of the boxes that we carry around in our head, then I think maybe I will have at least started us. But let me start with two anecdotes. In the fall of 1990, a little more than a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the conservative foreign published journal, The National Interest, published a symposium on the post-Cold War future. What was the world going to look like now that the Soviet Union's moment in history clearly had passed? One of the contributors was Jean Kirkpatrick, whom you may remember as an extremely articulate Cold Warrior of the era. She had made waves at the United Nations as the ambassador in the first Reagan administration for her fierce opposition to the Soviet Union. But what she said now, in 1990, was that was past. The Cold War was over. The extraordinary demands on resources, on moral heroism, the demands for vigilance and world military presence that the Cold War had imposed upon the United States, this was gone. It was over. And the US could now turn its attention, turn its care and priorities back to the domestic concerns of the welfare of its citizens. It was time, she said, using her words, for the United States to be a normal country in a normal time. Well, maybe it wasn't the best of phrases. No country with an economy as world dominant as the US economy was in 1990 could be called normal. And no country with a military presence unrivaled in the world, as the United States had, as the Soviet Union crumbled, could be called normal. But the howl of dismay at that phrase, a normal country in a normal time, went well beyond any of this. And it wasn't only the competition between Kirkpatrick's suggestion that maybe US priorities ought to become more inward-looking as opposed to those in the Reagan administration who were already looking forward toward what was going to be called in the second Bush administration, a forward-leaning policy of looking out into a world of dangers. I think there was something highly problematic to many of her listeners in adding the word normal to America. That's what touched the words. The opposite of normal in these debates that I'm going to invite us to think about is exceptional. It's not a new idea, the exceptional character of the United States, but it is a new word. It's almost impossible to find before the Second World War. And it too is extremely loaded with emotion. Second anecdote. This spring, President Barack Obama was asked at a press conference in France if he subscribed to the philosophy of, quote, American exceptionalism. And you can see him trying to get his, he's a very adroit speaker, but I'll read you the first two sentences of his answer. You'll see he was struggling to find his terrain. He said, I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. And then he found what he was supposed to have said. I'm enormously proud of my country and its role in history and the world. But the recovery wasn't quick enough for the conservative editorialists who circulated that first sentence with derision through the blogosphere for months after Barack Obama said it. The reporter used the word exceptionalism because it had been a powerful word in the campaign, especially in Sarah Palin's speeches. Her take was simpler. Quote, "America is an exceptional country, and you are all exceptional Americans," she told campaign crowds. "We are an exceptional nation." Now maybe she meant good or great, as in America is a great country, and you are all great Americans. And maybe the reason that Kirkpatrick got in trouble with the word normal is that normal tends to mean bad. It's what everybody wants to be better than, just as Garrison Keillor reminds me so often. And maybe what got Barack Obama in trouble wasn't his words, but a kind of role-switching problem. Presidents of the United States aren't supposed to imagine themselves into what other people think. Not out loud, at any rate, and not in public. Their job is to speak for their country. Let the British Prime Minister and the Greek Prime Minister speak for theirs, stick to the rule. But there's something more in this word exceptionalism, or the word normal, that freights it so heavily in academic debates, and on the campaign trail, and even in ordinary speech, where most of us don't often care very much about five-syllable words in a way that this one seems to make us care. The fights are particularly intense. The anxieties raised are also intense. And the convictions that splay out from it are polarized. I want to try to do two things in this lecture. One is to ask, with a little bit of care, as much care as I can muster, what is at stake that makes these debates over exceptionalism not only interesting intellectually, but so laden with emotion? And second, since I take on these issues as an historian, and because notions of history, as I want to argue, are absolutely central to this argument over American exceptionalism, I want to talk about some recent turns in historical scholarship that may help us enter more dispassionately and perhaps a little bit more wisely into this fiercely contested terrain. So here's my outline: 3 different meanings of exceptionalism, 3 different currents of historiography, some kind of coda at the end, and we'll see where I go. Of all the things at stake, the one that's closest to the surface is pride. To say that the United States is an exceptional nation is to speak in the language of patriotism. It is to say one is proud of the nation one lives in. It may be more than that. It may be a particularly strong claim of pride. To say Americans are exceptional often means to say the Americans are best of all the nations. We are the first, we are the best, was the way Ronald Reagan put it. Those are other things that didn't work quite right in Obama's relativizing of the word, because the Greeks might think that they are exceptional in the meaning of the word best. They might think they're best, and the Brits might think they're best. But only one nation can be best, and so if best really, exceptionalism really means best, there's only one exceptional nation that's really possible. But Obama was onto an important point, because the formulation of certain claims of bestness, certain claims of pride, certainly, are part of what nations do. They cannot exist without these rituals and terms in which patriotic pride is produced. It's the production of the kind of loyalty that makes people willing to obey the law, as opposed to violating it, or as opposed to assuming that one's own more local law, or the law of one's kinds and one's people, should trump the law of the nation. It's what makes people assent to paying taxes, even if they grumble. It what makes people ready to stand to be drafted into the army in an emergency, and in fact, to join at the risk of their lives into this endeavor of defending the thing called the nation. Without patriotism, without some words of pride, strong words of pride, the modern nation falls apart, or it holds together only by coercion. But here's the irony. The patriotic words that we say about ourselves pull us apart from the rest of the world. Exceptional, better than, best. But the ritual, the patriotic ritual, is something we share in common with those who live in nations all over the world. It's a form that's spread as far as the nation itself. There's one more thing perhaps to be said about the pride that's at stake here. For most persons, not all persons of course, but still for most persons, nationhood is an accident. It's not, for most persons, a matter of choice. It's not like picking through the websites of all the colleges you're interested in, and bidding on and trying to become You don't get bid on at age 18 and become an American. You are an American because you're born in America, or because your parents were Americans, or some kind of accident over which you have absolutely no control, just in the same way that you become a Japanese, German, whatever. Birth nations are like birth families. You have to learn to love and appreciate what you have no choice in. But there's a line of difference, too. Because though it's impolite and it may be deeply traumatic, you can actually break your loyalty to your family. You can reject their values. You can complain about their treatment of you. You can say that you believe they weren't at all the best parents for you, or even the best parents that the world ever saw. And families have exits, even if they're very painful and emotionally fraught exits. But nations, by contrast, are more demanding. The social risk of dissing your nation is actually higher than the social risk of dissing your family. The kind of allegiance they ask for is much less qualified, and both the actual and the emotional exits from patriotism are much more difficult. Patriotism involves making into a point of terrific pride something about which you actually have very little choice. It's a way of alchemizing accident. And so it appears as if it's choice. It's a way of acquiescing in the enormous power of modern nations, making powers of agency where there's in fact very little freedom. It's how we make the best of where we are and love what we are given. And that's a human universal, and we shouldn't denigrate it in any way, but we might recognize that the fact that nation patriotism asks us to be proud in something that is not of our own will may explain one of the reasons why these debates are so fraught and why questions of pride quickly move into arguments more intense than others. The second of things that's at stake is a question of time. And here I'm going to divide this into two. To say the nation is best is fine, but best is a fragile thing. Best for now, but in the normal course of things, best is never forever. Your favorite sports team may be on a streak right now, but no one imagines, no matter how loyal you are to them, or how much money they spend on their farm teams, that they will be best forever. But when we talk about exceptionalism, as America is an exceptionalist nation, we mean something different than that. We mean about best, or at least different, uncomparable to other nations at the beginning, and now, and in the future. We have a notion of endurance. Exceptionalism is for the ages. One form that claim takes is, and has run through much American history, and as you know well, is the claim that the United States is God's chosen nation that has a special relationship with the divine that no other nation has. Exceptionalism may not mean best in this case, but it means being chosen. We know that's straight in U.S. history, the sense of incarnating a special purpose, being given a special world mission, being a city on a hill to which the eyes of the world will be riveted. John Winthrop, who wrote those words, the city upon a hill. When he wrote those words, of course, he was not an American. He was an Englishman. He had not reached North America yet. He was either somewhere in the harbor, or, as I tend to think, I'm pretty sure I write about this, somewhere in mid-Atlantic. And it's not clear that he imagined he would stay in the North American continent. As he wrote in the letters that he wrote ahead of time, trying to explain why he was leaving, he thought of his voyage and the voyage of the Puritans who had elected him their governor as a moment of temporary refuge, a taking of a candlestick, which otherwise might be snuffed out in England, away for a while until it could be brought back to reignite the flame of what he thought of as religious purity and religious freedom in England. The idea of a city upon the hill was English before it was American. The idea of being a chosen nation with a special mission given by God was English before it was American. And the language of those English prophets of the national chosen ones took their rhetoric straight from the Old Testament, a dream of being a new Israel, like that other chosen nation, blessed with a new covenant with God and endowed with a holy mission. one can rattle on through this. The number of nations that have imagined themselves to be specially chosen by God is actually quite large. They have, certainly many nations we're familiar with. There's certainly large parts of modern Islam in which those who speak for their nation imagine themselves to be carrying a special mission, a special chosenness. There have been armies that have met on battlefields, some of them not very far from here, who thought that they had God on their sides, and there they were. That doesn't make it not a powerful claim. It's an exceedingly powerful claim, even though it's pretty common in the world. It has rattled through American history. It's put its blessings on the idea of manifest destiny in the West. It put its blessings on Woodrow Wilson's idea of coming to Europe's rescue in the First World War. But there's a wrinkle here, just as it's a kind of wrinkle in national pride that I think is worth attending to just for a minute. And I borrow this from a wonderful book by Nicholas Guyot called Providence and the Invention of the United States, in which Nick Guyot argues that there are actually two different understandings of being chosen by God. One is that God is inside your own national history, acting through it, empowering it, making that nation's actions an impression of the divine will upon the world. That's one meaning of being chosen. But the other meaning of being chosen is, which has actually a lot more theological tradition to it, is that what being chosen means is being watched more carefully by God, by actually having to live up to higher standards than everybody else, and risking, if you don't live up to those standards, being especially punished by God for messing up. That was what Winthrop meant. He didn't mean that America was a city upon the hill. He didn't. Forget about the American part. He didn't mean that the Puritan settlement was going to ever and always be a city upon the hill. What he says there is that if the Puritans should live up to the ideals and mandates of charity and justice that they were given, they would be upon, as a city upon the hill, and the eyes of the world would be upon them. And if they did not, they would be a laughingstock throughout the entire world. This is a somewhat scarier understanding of being chosen. This is what Garrison said when he ripped up the Constitution in his protest against slavery, by saying that God would judge this nation so harshly unless it immediately ended the system of slavery that it would become a laughingstock to the world. It's a question that Lincoln wrestled with. You can still find the tension between these two meanings of chosenness, between the idea of God being uniquely immanent in American history and the idea of God as keeping a special watch and a special judgment upon Americans. What's interesting is that the latter, which was historically more common, is actually very muted now. So when it's said that this or that calamity must be the result of God's anger over American sinfulness, as some preachers said, with lots of theological tradition behind them after the destruction of the trade towers, this comes as a statement that must be retracted very quickly, must be papered over. We prefer to think of God in American history than as God standing in judgment for American history. Either way, these are hard claims, and no wonder people argue so deeply about them. There's a third theological claim, and those of you who know your history of American theology should know this and do know this, that God makes no covenants with nations whatsoever. This was a point that Reinhold Niebuhr made in the 1950s and 1960s, though we don't hear it very much anymore. And Niebuhr argued it was the height of human pride and hubris to imagine that God actually cared about things in that way. So I've talked a little bit about pride, I've talked a little bit about theology. But at the heart of the exceptionalist claim, both in the world of scholarship and in popular argument, is a claim about history. It's a claim that U.S. history is different from everyone else's history. It is that from the beginning, the societies that were to become the United States were set off on a radically different course from all others. Their history was shaped by conditions radically unlike any others, propelled by principles and forces radically different from others. It was embarked, it is said, on a different current through time than any other nation. And that's why it could not be normal, why it could never be normal. Because it was operating under historical rules that were different from the normal path of development. Exceptionalism is not an argument about difference. All nations are different from any other nation. The case for exceptionalism is that the history and the future of the United States is different, not just in its details, but in that it follows rules of its own. The world's historical rules here, and American exceptionalism there. Now, there have been moments when one could plausibly imagine this was the way the world worked. When Alexis de Tocqueville came in the early 19th century, when an experiment in a democratic republic, even if it was a democratic republic only for certain Americans, was almost unknown in a world of monarchies. The United States did look as if it might be operating under principles and in a world of historical forces unique to itself. At the end of the Second World War, when Europe lay in rubble, when the economies that had been so important rivals to the United States earlier were completely destroyed, one might argue that the United States was operating by principles and historical forces of its own. The word exceptionalism comes from just that moment, when American historians and American social scientists looking across at Europe imagined a gulf between them that was so large that they occupied different histories. But the world has changed around historians, and history writing has changed. And the abnormality of US history is a lot less clear now at the beginning of the 21st century than it was at the middle of the 20th century, even though we're taking a long time to catch up. The embeddedness of US history within larger world historical forces seems much more striking now. So I want to talk just briefly about 3 areas of historical work that seems to me to have pushed this line of reasoning forward, and to have, which are able to help us shed some light on this question, this fraught set of questions about exceptionalism. One is the new history of immigration in the light of the world population movements of the present. Second is the new history of empire. And the third is the work that has questioned how different the US actually is from other highly developed economies and societies after all. Immigration, empire, difference. Of all the stories we tell about the United States, the immigration story is one of the foundational. The Ellis Island story, the Statue of Liberty story, because it's a story about the United States as operating as a magnet to the world, a place of exceptional appeal, a destination point, the arrival at which made something new that had just never been seen in the world before. That's what the word melting, the term melting pot, meant. Out of all the old stuff of the world, in the furnaces that were America, something different that had never been seen before the world came to be. The term melting pot, of course, didn't actually originate in the United States, as I think you know. The melting pot was popularized as a phrase, not by an American, but by an English Jewish writer and playwright, Israel Zangwill. And he pulled his story almost completely out of materials that he found around him in London. His main character, David, was an extremely talented composer, a Jewish musician, who had fled in just a terrible trauma as a child in the Russian city of Kishinev. In a pogrom, his mother and sisters had been murdered brutally, and he had barely escaped. But he come to London to try to start life again. And then to New York, where the play is set. And in New York, he falls in love with a beautiful, beautiful Russian girl. And if you have a good imagination for how plays are going to work, you already know what's going to happen, which is that the Russian girl's father comes to visit to see this new lover, and it turns out to have been exactly the man who had murdered David's mother. They're trying to start something new, and the past floods in upon them. They cannot escape. But David insists he will escape. He'll write an American symphony that in the great melting pot of America, he will believe that the past can be burned away. That's the story. It's a very, very powerful story. And sociologists of immigration in the 1950s, 1960s, even though they didn't use the word smelting, they used the word acculturation, talked about something like that, about how identities became new in the United States of America. And some of this still goes on, but it's not the way that sociologists or historians write about immigration now. As immigration opened up after its 40-year freeze, between 1924 and 1964, and the world began to come once more in millions into the United States, the patterns no longer seem quite to fit those of Israel Zangwill's longing. Immigrants move all over the world now, but not simply toward the United States. As indeed we now realize in the 19th century, they didn't move just toward the United States either. It's a world of global labor flows, of workers reaching out through networks and family chains for labor. Sometimes those chains are short and the labor is close at hand. Sometimes it's on another continent. Labor moves, remittances return, kin and neighbors pack themselves up for distant places. They go back. They cycle other neighbors and kin through these global labor networks. Becoming American or burning off one's memories and identities has, in the first instance, almost nothing to do with it. A transnational phenomenon is a new word for this. Global labor migrants make very complicated sets of identities, amalgams of identities. They're not persons without a nation, they're persons with multiple nations, engaged in more than one nation-making project, simultaneously Guatemala and New Jersey, Mexican and Los Angeles, and things in between. And as historians of immigration have looked back from this present moment to the past, they begin to realize that the great immigration movements of the 19th century were not all that much different. Then too, millions upon millions of persons moved all over the globe. Then too, the great majority of them responding much more to capital moves and labor demands than to dreams of making themselves over as new persons, even if that should happen to the children. And immigrants came not to America, they came to very, very particular places in America through the chains of kin and country folk, that helped find their way into a familiarity, a resource of language and faith and ethnic neighborhood. Anecdotes are never any substitute for history, but one of my great-grandfathers, who was a sailor, decided for some reason it's just not passed down the family lore that he was going to become a farmer. And so he got himself somehow out to Iowa and managed not to go completely running a farm. But he could have gone to Australia, he could have gone to Canada. It's not quite clear he knew where Iowa was. My wife's grandmother, one of her grandmothers, went to New York City because all the boys in her Irish village had already gone to New York City. And she met her husband in a boarding house, an Irish boarding house in New York City. He had already helped her when she was young in school in Ireland. She met him again. They married and lived happily ever after. It's these tiny micro systems that drew people to America, that draw people to America now, not some larger understanding of nation, not even the Statue of Liberty. And persons like this carry deep memories, unlike Zangwill's fantasy. So anti-Catholic feelings poured over from the deep religious tensions in Europe. Henry Ford had his workers enact the melting pot. At one moment on the auditorium at his Dearborn plant, he had workers come dressed in old world exotic costumes, and they got up on ladders, and this was kind of fake for stage, right? But they appeared to dive into this melting pot that came out with coveralls as proper Americans. But Henry Ford allowed no Jews to live in Dearborn and no Jews to work in the Dearborn plant. Memory was still very, very much there. Immigration was not forever. People went back. It was not a one-way street. As travel costs cheapened, more and more millions went back. And remittances went back to Sicily or to South China. Millions of immigrants came, millions returned, or set out for different locations. And it was not always free. In the late 18th century, most of the persons historians tell us. Most of the persons by far who came across the Atlantic were not seekers of the American promise. They were slaves. They were objects in a truly transnational flow of goods and commerce. None of these particulars were unknown to immigration historians before, but in this new story of global flows and circulations, of mixed and hybrid national identities, we've begun to embed the history of immigration in the United States into much larger world patterns. Global historical forces. How exceptional can a nation's history be when so much of its very peopling is so deeply entangled in world history? That's the question that immigration historians are asking now. The second area of work is actually much more recent. That's the new history of the American empire. It came about rather suddenly. When I was in graduate school, which of course was a zillion years ago, but even much more recently than that, perhaps until the last 10 years, there was a story about empire. And it went like this, that other nations had them, but the United States did not. In the 1890s, the great powers of Europe carved up Africa into its spheres of influence and colonies. The United States stayed aloof. Shortly thereafter, those same great powers went into China, demanding enclaves in the Chinese coast cities. And the United States did not, but simply asked that it be allowed in at the same terms as others. When the Japanese forced their way across East and Southeast Asia, and the Germans forced their way across Central Europe, the US stood up as their enemy, and not only an enemy to those particular nations, but to an enemy to the concept of empire itself. Granted, there had been the Philippine experiment in European-style empire and the Puerto Rican one, but they were small, and they were thought to be somewhat of an aberration in US history. The US was a great power, but not an empire. That was the line until about 10 years ago. I think the trigger was the US invasion of Iraq. It rattled its way through the historical profession in a major, major way. Part of it because it did seem to be enunciating new principles for American foreign policy. As the Bush administration defined what it called the forward strategy of freedom, it would now push back against a world of dangers, if necessary. The administration said by preemptive military action, by invasion if necessary, by the establishment of client regimes if necessary, by military commitments abroad without deadlines if that's what freedom needed in a dangerous world. It would not wait, but it would project its power wherever that was needed. A few of the conservative journalists at the time, in fact, used the E word, that what the disturbed world needed at this moment was empire. Just as the 19th century world had needed the Brits with their jodhpurs and their pith helmets, and it was about time that the US understood that this was a responsibility it could not evade. But the question was there, how different was this new policy than the policy of outward projection of power, which we call empire? Well, there's a huge debate among historians of empire about this. Books and books go out of the press. But what was interesting is how strong the voices were, arguing that not only this looked a lot like historical forms of empire, but that it was actually congruent with a long imperial strain in the American past. Harvard's European historian Charlie Mayer, in a powerful angry book called Among Empires, wrote of the anatomy of empires, including that of the United States, the asymmetry of power that they maintained, the zones of violence that inevitably inflamed their borders, the draining of resources from the globe that they entailed. He did this from a sort of center-left perspective, if you want to try to put him in a box. His colleague in the Harvard's history department, Al Ferguson, was pretty willing to put himself in a box as a deep, committed, and intelligent supporter of the Bush administration doctrine. And his book, Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, defended the American past as an imperial past, as one in which the United States had in fact acted the part of European empires. It just hadn't been quite brave enough or honest enough with itself to speak its own name. The world needed empires, and the US, in fact, had often played this. When historians of the United States went back and looked at the familiar, some set pieces of American history, suddenly, for many of them, these came out in a different pattern than before. Guns and violence were put back in what had been called, in this rather benign term, Westward Expansion. The seizure of Mexico's northwest provinces in a fit of jingoistic war that didn't look too much different from the mood of the Boer War in England began to seem something less than an inevitable movement out to the Pacific. During a period which is falsely known as a period of isolationism, American historians began to talk about continuing military incursions into Mexico and the Caribbean to set regimes right, the forced deaths, doing something very similar to what the British Navy did around the world. And at the end of the Second World War, the American projection of power and military bases all over the world may have been a defensive move, and it certainly was nose to nose with the Soviet Union, but it doesn't look, they say, too different from empire after all. If empire means the projection of power, cultural, economic, but especially military power beyond one's borders, then the US was not only an outpost of empire at the very beginning, but quickly undertook the mission of making an empire of its own. This seems uncomfortable to imagine. That's in part because historians have so long focused on only one of empire's historical manifestations. That's a direct, authoritarian, racist rule of others as lesser peoples. That's what we think of when we think of empires. The real empires of the 19th century, in those empires, this was only one of the possible phases of empire. There's another, and in fact often more common form of imperial domination and imperial rationale, which worked through softer means, through the establishment of client states and client regimes advised by the French or the British, but not directly ruled, subject always to invasion if something happened, but then retreat after that when things were set right. And the rationale for this more dominant form of invasion was not pure power and pure resources extraction, but the spread of law and property rights and civilized customs and Christianity and schools and lessons in representative government and decent treatment of women. The empire was a civilizing force, the imperialists said. Liberal imperialism, if you will. But it doesn't look all that different from what American administrators said in the Philippines. And it may not look all that much different from what sometimes is said now. Anyway, there's a whole new set of books which you should be aware of, thinking about the patterns of empire in the American past, rethinking the history of the American West as a clash of empires. Becca Hanlon's wonderful new book on the Comanche Empire is one of those that stood in the way of the U.S. empire. Books bringing the Philippines and Puerto Rico back into the core, not just the margins of U.S. history. A new spate of books about the American presence abroad, in Guantanamo, in Panama, pushing our sense of U.S. history out to its actual frontiers, far beyond the maps that we still print in history books, and in the process, embedding it in world history. The third and the last of the historical trends I want to speak to briefly is a very radical suggestion that the differences that Americans like to imagine between themselves and the countries of Europe, New World and Old World, that classic US European dyad, just simply aren't as large as we tend to imagine. It's a new book by the UCLA European historian Peter Baldwin, which was published last year, in which Old World, New World, dynamic America, tired socialist Europe all seem to dissolve. And the contrast that we take as familiar turns into a kaleidoscope. There are some places, taking Peter Baldwin's book, which is not a political book at all, it's full of graphs, and it was long if you care to look at that. There are some places where the United States stands out from the norm of European countries, some of which you know, and some of which are in the papers most every day. Income inequality is higher in the US than in any European country. The percentage of the population in poverty is higher in the US than in any European country, though not terribly much more than in Greece or Ireland, or Spain, or the United Kingdom. The United States, as most of us know, spends a higher percentage of its gross national product on education if you count both private and public spending. It spends a much, much higher proportion on health, as everybody should know by now, 1.5 times its nearest competitor. There's more obesity in the United States than elsewhere. There's more infant mortality. These are familiar ways of perhaps not the United States coming out best, but certainly coming out in a world of its own. Other contrasts are not quite as well known. At least one that surprised me is that the US tax system is more progressive than that in any European country. In Switzerland, which doesn't come out very well in these tales, but the percentage of total taxes paid by the richest 10% is only half of what it is in the United States. But the most important finding of Peter Baldwin's new book is that in most of these measures, the United States simply doesn't fall at one end or the other. It's just in the mix of normal, wealthy, highly economically developed countries. Religion, we know, plays a distinctive and highly visible role in US politics. But it's not the country in which weekly church attendance is highest. That's Ireland. And it's just about tied with Portugal for the number of people who say they believe very, very strongly in the existence of God. The US is a country of very pronounced patriotism, but the country where the highest percentage of people tell pollsters they are very proud of their nation isn't the United States, it's Portugal. We lament the failure of Americans to turn out in elections, and we should, but it turns out that though election turnout is low in the US, it's still lower in Switzerland. Americans are car obsessed, but the ownership of cars per person is just about in the middle of the European countries in the United States. Everybody watches television in the United States. We watch way too much television in the United States, and they watch way too much television, as it turns out, in Italy, just about the same thing. But book sales are higher in the United States than anywhere else. And there's only one other nation that sells more pianos per person than the United States. Guns matter in America, deeply. But gun ownership per person is higher in Finland. There are a lot of homeowners in the US, but the percentage of the population owning their homes in the United States is just about in the European middle. It's far behind Spain and Greece, and just about in the tie with Britain. In total crime, the United States is about in the middle. What it stands out in is murder rate, which is twice that of its closest competitor, which is Switzerland, and its prison population, which is 6 times that of its closest competitor, which is Luxembourg. We think we're going to find polarities, and we find spectra, we find a kaleidoscope. There are differences, but often not nearly as large. And once you add the differences between American states, the whole thing turns out to be much more complicated than the exceptionalist argument ever allowed us to imagine. The assumption of dramatic across-the-board differences between the US and the other advanced industrial countries turns into a whole set of really important, extremely important, but smaller scale problems. Like why the incarceration rate is so high in the United States, or the murder rate, or the piano buying, for that matter. The narcissism of minor differences is Baldwin's phrase for the ways in which all these differences have been exaggerated and polarized. But what he says more briefly is just as important, is that what accounts for the sameness is that all these countries have been washed over by the same global historical forces. The forces of democratization, the forces of trade and economic development, the demands for public services, the concerns about ability to pay for those public services. Those are transnational. They make us just like all other countries in the world. Every nation responds differently to those historical pressures, and they mix the ingredients differently. So each is uniquely unlike another, but none is exceptional. I'm going to close here with one more thought. Not with a sense of having closed off the questions I posed, but with some luck giving at least some context and a slightly sharper edge to some of them. Does all this historical work demonstrate that the US is a normal country after all? That it is a country of immigrants like many other countries of immigrants with their complicated connections and identities? Does it mean that it's a country which made itself into a kind of an empire, different, but not wholly different from the other great empires of the past? Is it a country that stands out from the other wealthy countries of the present only on a few statistical measures, that don't mesh very well with our popular stereotypes about us and the rest of the world. I don't think normal is going to get us where we need to go. Normal only recapitulates the notion that somewhere out there is the way things are, and we're here. It seems to me that the lesson of the new history, and perhaps the way of getting some traction on these terribly fraught issues that come up when we talk about exceptionalism, is to imagine the United States as embedded in, as always having been, embedded in the forces of historical motion around the world. The exceptionist claim would suggest the opposite, that there's something in American history itself that's different from the rest of the world. It's subject to historical rules and destinies that are all its own. It's a mythic and powerfully utopian idea, and it's had a powerful impact on the peoples and nations that have embraced it. But the premises, I think, have never been nearly as firm as the longings and the imaginings.